Here is a story about a company that had everything. The products worked, the developers loved them, the market position was real, the $57 billion valuation at peak was not a meme, it was backed by genuine utility, genuine adoption, and genuine trust from hundreds of thousands of developers who had built their careers on this platform. Then they decided to change some things. What follows is a chronicle of decisions that individually might have each been survivable. Together, they managed to vaporize roughly $51 billion of shareholder value in about 3 years, cycled through 3 CEOs, run 4 rounds of layoffs, generate a termination threat from one of their own employees, and hand their market to an open source engine that runs on donations, in a partridge in a pear tree. This is Unity Technologies, and unlike most corporate disaster stories, you cannot really blame the market, or the competition, or bad timing, or forces beyond anyone's control. Every fork in this road has a sign, and they proceeded to take the wrong turn on all of them. To understand how badly this went wrong, you have to understand that it did not start this way. Unity genuinely changed who could make games. Before Unity, a small team trying to build and ship across multiple platforms needed serious engineering resources, serious money, and serious infrastructure just to get started. Unity cut through all of that. They offered a real, functional, cross-platform engine at a price that ranged from free to affordable, and developers responded by building on it at a scale that made Unity essentially synonymous with indie game development. The IPO in September 2020 at $52 per share was earned. By November 2021, the company was worth $57 billion. That number was sitting on a real foundation, real market share, real developer adoption, real trust. By some estimates, around half of all mobile games and a significant portion of indie PC games were running on Unity. That is genuine market penetration. The CEO at the time was John Riccitiello, who had previously run EA, which, yes, is worth noting, which, yes, is the same guy that talked about reloading, making people pay to reload on Battlefield, the same guy that had EA voted as worst company of the year, despite the fact that we were recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. But he did seem to understand that Unity's value came from developers choosing Unity. The developer relationship was the product. Everybody seemed to be on the same page about this. And then the page turned. In December of 2021, Unity acquired Weta Digital, the VFX technology division of Peter Jackson's effects studio, responsible for The Lord of the Rings, Avatar, and basically every film that made visual effects people feel smug at dinner parties, for $1.63 billion. The strategic logic was, Unreal was making moves into film production through its virtual production pipeline, and Unity wanted to compete. The execution was, they bought the engineering talent and tools of one of the most prestigious VFX houses in the world, let Peter Jackson keep the artist and the name for a separate company called Weta FX, and then spent about 2 years figuring out what to do with what they had. The answer turned out to be nothing sustainable. By November of 2023, Unity exited the agreement entirely, laying off 265 employees right before Christmas, nice present, and handed the Weta Digital name back to Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson, as you see, will be the only winner in this situation because he had sold his own technology for $1.6 billion, kept his artists, kept his studio, continued winning Oscars, and then got the name back. Unity got a tax write-off. But Weta was almost a footnote compared to ironSource. In July of 2022, Unity announced they were merging with ironSource, a mobile ad tech company, in a deal valued at $4.4 billion at a 74% premium. ironSource, for those unfamiliar, was a company that had at various points in its history had software classified as malware by multiple security researchers. Their install client had been bundled with adware and described in terms that most companies would not want attached to an acquisition target. Unity knew this. They then bought the deal anyway. The announcement came immediately after Unity laid off 4% of their workforce. They cited challenging advertising conditions, then announced a $4 billion acquisition of an advertising company. Then, Riccitiello, in a separate interview the same week, called indie developers who do not prioritize monetization early in development some of the biggest fucking idiots. He later apologized and said his word choice was crude. The apology did not undo the vibe. September 12, 2023. Unity published a blog post. The post announced the runtime fee, a new pricing model under which developers would be charged a fee every time a Unity-powered game was installed once the game crossed certain thresholds. The initial terms were 20 cents per install for personal play and users above $200,000 in revenue, and 200,000 lifetime installs. For Pro and Enterprise users, the number were different, but the concept was the same. Unity was going to take a cut of every install from your profit, retroactively counting from January of 2023. The immediate developer response was what you might generously call comprehensive. Studios began announcing Godot migration plans within hours. Godot is important here. Calls of the Lamb's developers threatened to pull the game from all storefronts before the fee went live. Developers raised the install bombing concern, the scenario where a competitor or bad actor installs your game 1,000,000 times to rack up your Unity fees, and Unity's response was that they had fraud detection practices from their ad serving technology. The same ad serving technology that came with Iron Source. Developers did not find this reassuring. 2 Unity offices were evacuated after what the company described as a credible termination threat. It later emerged that the threat had been made from a Unity company, a Unity employee, which tells you a lot about the very stable infrastructure of the company. Over the following 10 days, Unity issued 3 separate revisions to the fee structure, each time walking back the teams after the backlash didn't stop. First, they clarified that reinstalls wouldn't count. Then they said that games under $1 million annual revenue would be exempt. They then said that developers could self-report installs rather than having Unity track them. The revisions kept coming because the original announcement was so poorly structured that each clarification created new questions. By the time Richatello resigned in October, effective immediately, there was no transition, he was just gone. The fee had been revised so many times that nobody could clearly articulate where the current terms actually were. Bromberg, the incoming CEO, eventually scrapped the runtime fee entirely, but by then it didn't matter. The question had been asked and answered publicly in front of everybody 3 weeks straight, and then revised 5 times. You can cancel a policy, but you can't really cancel the fact that you announced it. John Riccitelli resigned in October of 2023, effective immediately. The timing was clean, the runtime fee had just detonated public trust, the stock was in absolute freefall, and the developer community was in open revolt. He did not stay to manage the aftermath of any decision he made, he was simply no longer there. For context on Riccitelli, before Unity, he ran EA from 2007 to 2013. If you were around in 2012, EA released Mass Effect 3 with controversial Day 1 DLC and loot box mechanics. That year, EA won the Consumerist's Worst Company in America award 4 years after the recession. The following year, after Dead Space's 3 microtransaction backlash, they won it again. Then, Riccitelli resigned from EA. Then, 11 years later, he called indie developers fucking idiots for not prioritizing monetization, announced a merger with a company that had malware in its history, and launched a per-install pricing model that generated threats of termination. Jim Whitehurst stepped in as interim CEO. Whitehurst was the former CEO of Red Hat, which is an enterprise Linux company, which has approximately nothing to do with game engines or developer trusts or any of the specific situations Unity was navigating. His job, as best as anyone could determine, was to visibly be not Riccitelli, while the company figured out what came next. He lasted 7 months. Matthew Bromberg took over in May of 2024. Bromberg came from Zynga, a company whose business model has been compared, repeatedly and not charitably, to slot machine design applied to mobile games. This was the hire that the board made to rebuild credibility with indie developers. It may have been the best available option. That is a sentence worth sitting with. The stock peaked at over $200 a share in November of 2021, representing a company valuation of around $57 billion. By September of 2024, it was sitting at roughly $18, valuing the company at around $6 billion. That is $51 billion destroyed. If you want to put that in perspective, $51 billion is roughly the GDP of Estonia and a couple of sports teams. Unity evaporated it in 3 years. The Iron Source deal costed $4.4 billion at a 74% premium. Unity eventually shut down Iron Source as a standalone operation entirely. The ad tech thesis never materialized. AppLovin, the direct competitor Unity had tried to be with the Iron Source acquisition, saw its stock increase by approximately 800% in 2024 alone, while Unity was writing off its mobile advertising ambitions, the same market at the same period of time. The Weta deal cost $1.63 billion. Unity returned the name to Peter Jackson, terminated the service agreement, laid off 265 people, and retained the technology which it said it would evaluate. Weta FX started rehiring the engineers Unity let go. The company ran 4 rounds of layoffs in roughly 18 months, 4% in June of 2022, 284 in January 2023, 600 in May of 2023, and then 25% of the entire global workforce in February of 2024. Over 3,200 jobs across the cuts. 3 CEOs, $51 billion. For comparison, that is more than Nintendo's total market cap for most of the early 2000s, much more than Sega paid for Atlas, and more than the entire annual revenue of the global indie game market. Before September 12, 2023, Godot was not a serious competitive threat to Unity. This is not a knock on Godot. It is a fine engine, actively developed, with a clean open source license and a dedicated community. But it is what you used when you wanted freedom and control and were willing to trade some polish and ecosystem depth to get it. It was the principled choice, not the default one. The runtime fee announcement changed that in approximately 1 news cycle. Godot's donation numbers spiked within days. GitHub activity exploded. Studios that had been on Unity for years started publicly posting migration timelines. The Godot Foundation reported doubling its user base in a single month. By 2024, 5% of all games released on Steam were built in Godot, up from a negligible fraction 4 years earlier. At the GMTK Game Jam 2024, 39% of submitted games used Godot. 4 years prior, it had been 13%. The Megacrit situation is the clearest single data point. Megacrit, the studio behind Slay the Spire, scrapped 2 full years of Unity development to rebuild Slay the Spire 2 from the ground up in Godot. They announced this publicly, explicitly citing the runtime fee as the reason. Slay the Spire 2 hit over 570,000 concurrent players on Steam in early access, one of the biggest launches in Steam history. The game they rebuilt from scratch because of Unity's pricing announcement became one of the biggest early access launches in all time. Godot did not defeat Unity in the market. Godot has no marketing department, no sales team, no competitive strategy. It is run by a non-profit. Unity handed it tens of thousands of developers, gifted it the cultural narrative of being the trustworthy alternative, and generated more awareness for it in 3 weeks than Godot had managed on its own in a decade. So, what actually happened? The Iron Source acquisition was a bet that Unity could build a dominant mobile advertising business. That business required scale, and the ad tech market was consolidating, and Iron Source gave them tools that they did not have. The logic was not insane. The execution, announced immediately after layoffs, paired with the CEO publicly insulting the developer base at a 74% premium for a company with a malware history, was a disaster of presentation before you even get to the outcomes. The Weta acquisition was a bet that Unity could compete with Unreal in the firm and virtual production markets. Also, not an insane idea. Unreal's virtual production pipeline had real momentum and Unity wanted in. The problem is that they paid $1,600 for the engineering talent and tools of a world-class VFX house, couldn't integrate it within a coherent product strategy, and exited within 2 years. Peter Jackson, in this story, sold his tools for $1.6 billion, kept his artists, kept his films, and then got his name back. The deal that was supposed to establish Unity in the film industry actually established that Peter Jackson is great at the art of the deal. The runtime fee was the one that ended it. Not because it was the largest mistake financially. Well, technically it was if you count the unseen, but the Weta and Iron Source write-offs were bigger in dollar terms. But because it answered the foundational question of the developer relationship in the worst possible way, in the most public possible forum, with the most possible witnesses. Unity's market position was built on developers choosing them. The runtime feed told developers what happened after they chose. The revisions, the walkbacks, the eventual cancellation, all of that happened after the question was already answered. You can apologize, but you cannot unanswer a question. And you definitely cannot do it after evacuating your own offices because your employees are sending threats of termination.